walking virtually along the world's most revered footpaths and connecting the global community of pilgrims. It's the Sacred Steps Podcast. Available on YouTube and your favorite podcast app. Broadcasting from the Shea Mare Studios in Florida. Here's your host, Pilgrim backpacker and author, Kevin Donahue.
Buen Camino, pilgrims, and welcome back to the Sacred Steps Podcast. I'm Kevin Donahue, pilgrim, backpacker, author, and host of the Sacred Steps Podcast. On this show, we're walking virtually alongside pilgrims and authors, sharing their stories and connecting this community of pilgrims from across the world. For much of this season, we've been discussing pilgrimage along Spain's Camino de Santiago. We've spoken with Maria Seco from Spanish for Camino about words and phrases for the journey, and with Lee Brennan about her Camino and the powerful effect it had in her life, including her decision to move across the world from the United States to Spain and to become an ambassador, if you will, for the Camino de Santiago. On our previous episode, I interviewed Drs. Christian Greer and Michelle Oing about pilgrimage in general, about the Camino de Santiago specifically, but also branched off into a discussion about its sister UNESCO heritage route, Japan's Kumano Kodo. I love talking about all of these different routes, as this really reflects my pilgrim experience as well, walking throughout Europe, in the UK, and in the United States. So on today's episode, we're going back to England to talk with my good friend Andy Bull about England's original Camino route, the Walsingham Camino from London. But first, I'd be remiss if we didn't check in with our Camino pilgrim friends Brian J. Skillen and his partner Chelsea, who've been walking the Camino Frances all season to celebrate Brian's latest Camino book in the Through a Field of Stars trilogy, this one titled Home Through a Field of Stars. Buen Camino, Brian and Chelsea.
Hey, Kevin, buen camino.
You've been walking the Camino Frances, and we've been following you every episode of this season on the podcast. The two of you are getting closer to Santiago de Compostela.
After some unexpected twists and turns, we have made it to Santiago, starting in St. Jean 33 days ago. And yeah, we made it.
We're really excited to be here. And at the beginning of our Camino, we got the advice, never give up on a bad day. Mm-hmm. And even though we had some days that we felt like giving up, I'm really happy that we continued.
Congratulations to both of you. Overcoming COVID and various circumstances. I am so happy for you, Brian and Chelsea. Every Camino creates its own memories, and the two of you have done this route several times. I'm curious, what will you remember about this special Camino?
Yeah, we met so many wonderful pilgrims, had great conversations, saw beautiful sights.
And I might have even gotten a prequel to my series.
Yeah.
As veteran pilgrims, how are you experiencing Santiago de Compostela this time?
One of my favorite things about getting to Santiago is just sitting in front of the cathedral in the square and watching the pilgrims come in. Like when we got into the square, we arrived and it was rainy and the weather cleared out and we were able to just sit with our Camino family and enjoy, seeing everyone celebrate and reconnect and
And I think if I lived in Santiago, if I was ever having a bad day, I would just come sit in this square and really enjoy it because it's one of the best things.
So true. I remember sitting in Santiago and seeing all the pilgrims arrive and actually starting to think about my own next steps. So I think our next steps, Brian and Chelsea, are to have the two of you join us for a full episode coming up soon on the podcast.
Now, just like the other pilgrims, one chapter is changing, is closing, and a new chapter in our life is opening up. And we're super excited to talk with you again later on. So, buen camino, everybody.
Buen camino.
Bye.
Buen Camino, Brian and Chelsea. I'm looking forward to debuting an episode very soon with Camino author Brian J. Skilling and his partner Chelsea. If you're not familiar with Brian's fiction, following elements of the Knights Templar on a series of twisty journeys through the Camino towns and villages, you'll find his 3-book Camino series titled Through a Field of Stars on Amazon. I'll add the links down below in our show notes. Thank you so much to all of you for your emails and messages this season. It's challenging being here on just one side of the conversation. It's me and this microphone. So I'm very grateful to get your email messages of support and your voicemail messages in particular. I'm also here, if I can, to be a resource and answer some of the questions that you have about your own journey. So let's pull up an email out of the mailbox. This one comes from Don, a pilgrim from the United States. He writes, "Last year I traveled to Spain and did the Camino de Santiago. My hope was that you could provide me with links to other pilgrimages in America. I would greatly appreciate it. The Camino has awesome infrastructure support, and I would like to find out what the Mission Trail and other U.S. pilgrimages have for support. I'm already addicted to the Camino, but traveling to Spain is expensive." Thanks again for the email, Don. I also find the simple experience of the Camino as a pilgrim to be richly rewarding. Eat, sleep, pray, walk, and just do it again. Everything you have in your backpack is everything you need. And I love that simple pilgrim life. Specifically in the United States, by far the most rewarding route is the California Missions Trail. I'll link details down below in the show notes, including a beginner's guide to this route. But the California Mission Trail connects the 21 Catholic missions established during the Spanish colonization of California, walking along America's Pacific coast from San Diego north to San Francisco, or south from San Francisco to San Diego, whatever you may be inclined to do, and every city in between. This is really such a varied route. Sand, beaches, mountains, valleys, forests, urban jungles, all connecting the missions that establish not only the Catholic faith in California, but also these iconic American cities that largely bear saint names: San Diego, San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Jose, Santa Clara, and so many more. And of course, that urban walking makes this a really different and particularly challenging fledgling Camino. There is a bit of infrastructure in mapping the route, but as far as albergues and pilgrim meals and some of those things, this is still a very challenging route because you're walking through just a fledgling Camino. I've recorded 4 or 5 episodes of the Sacred Steps podcast dedicated to the California Missions Trail, and I did sections of the walk back in, I want to say 2021. I might get in trouble. It might have been 2022, but I'm going to say 2021. I'll link those episodes and my blog post from One Step Then Another as a resource for you, Don. I will say I'm really excited to have a proper guidebook now for the California Missions Trail. On our very first episode back in 2020, gosh, that seems like a long time ago. Back in 2020, Cicerone guidebook author Sandy Brown shared he was working on a guidebook for California, and it's now available here in 2023 with the routes and tips for both walkers and cyclists. Sandy's going to be on the podcast later this season, so we'll dedicate some time to talking about California in an upcoming episode. That new guidebook is linked down below in our show notes, as well as the great Facebook group dedicated to walkers and some additional organizations supporting the trail. So that's the California Missions Trail, Don. I think another option for you seasonally is the Wisconsin Way. I have not done this route. I've considered it several times, but from a timing standpoint, this is really best done in the summer months in the United States. I know several U.S. pilgrim organizations have sponsored walks on this Marian Camino from, I think, around Champion, Wisconsin, over to the suburbs of Milwaukee. There's not a lot of support for the walk. Many people just drive it in a car. But for those that are interested in walking, there's a nice website dedicated to the journey, and Father Kurtz up at St. Mary Catholic Church is an ambassador for the journey. You can reach out, email him as well. So I'll link that route as well in the show notes for you, Don. I hope that helps you continue your Camino path in the United States. I will mention that depending on where you are in the United States, sometimes getting to California and the cost of what might be lodging, food, etc. in California may be very comparable to walking in the UK. So I'll just throw that out there. Look at our UK pilgrimages as well on the podcast website at sacredstepspodcast.com. Don, be well, stay safe, and buen camino, my friend. If you'd like to share your comments, thoughts, plans for your upcoming Camino, head over to our website at sacredstepspodcast.com and tap send a voicemail. Whether that's your phone, your tablet, or your computer, you can record a voice message and we may share it in an upcoming episode of the podcast. And for those of you planning your very first Camino, such an exciting time, we have a beginner video series on YouTube called Camino 101. Not only are we streaming all of our podcast episodes to YouTube, but you'll find this beginner pilgrim series with short videos answering really the most common questions people have about the Camino. From what route do I walk? What is the budget? Where can I stay? What should I pack? What apps should I have on my phone for the pilgrimage? Just some introductory elements for the Camino de Santiago. That's over on our YouTube channel, linked below at youtube.com/sacred steps. Finally, I just want to take a moment and give you an update. I'm continuing to work through edits, maybe final edits, on my very first Camino book called The Pilgrim's Table. It's the story of 5 pilgrims who come together over a memorable dinner at their albergue in Muxía at the end of their Camino de Santiago journeys. The story is based on my walks and really the tales that I've come into contact with while walking the Camino de Santiago, the Via Francigena, the California Mission Trails, and some others. I'm going to begin releasing some previews and excerpts from the book soon. So if you're interested in reading a bit of my very first book, go to thepilgrimstable.com and register for a free preview. I'm also thinking about changing up the cover. So if you want to vote perhaps in a future cover poll, make sure you're registered at thepilgrimstable.com. The plan for the book is to make it available on Amazon beginning in April. That would be just in time for Mother's Day gifts, Father's Day gifts, or maybe just something to carry with you on your journey this summer as you begin to write your own story, perhaps at an albergue, just like the one featured in my first book, The Pilgrim's Table. What can I say about English author Andy Bull that I haven't already said during his many episodes with us on the podcast? Andy's first pilgrimage book, called Pilgrim Pathways, is a guide to 20 short walks across the historic footpaths of England, Scotland, and Wales. I love this book because it is dedicated to making pilgrimage more accessible, introducing these historic routes in a way that can be experienced in just 1 or 2 days, or even expanded to their full-length, longer journeys. I always recommend Andy's book to those who are looking to experience a new Camino pilgrimage. Maybe you've done the Camino de Santiago and you're thinking to yourself, I'd really like something different, because walking in the UK and finding these routes is really just a wonderful experience. Andy was kind enough to meet with me in London when I was walking the Pilgrim's Way from London to Canterbury. And as we were standing on London Bridge, he was sharing with me so much of the history of these different pilgrimages, the chapel that had been dedicated to St. Thomas on London Bridge, and the story of one of England's most regarded pilgrimage walks, the Walsingham Camino. We walked to the modern day starting point just past London Bridge at St. Magnus the Martyr on the banks of the Thames, where I learned this route was once one of the 4 most traveled pilgrimages in all of Christendom, alongside Rome, Jerusalem, and Compostela. With the support of the Confraternity of St. James and many of the churches and villages and towns along this route, Andy has a new book dedicated to this historic walk, and today we're discussing England's original pilgrimage walk, the Walsingham Camino, on the Sacred Steps podcast. Andy Bull, welcome back to the Sacred Steps podcast. Good to see you, my friend.
Yeah, good to see you too, Kevin. I'm glad you survived that hurricane.
Yeah, we got a little bit of wind and awful lot of rain and no power for a bunch of days. So you and I were planning to record this episode, and then Hurricane Ian got in our way. So I appreciate you making time for us today. Welcome back to the podcast. We are talking about your newest book, A Labor of Love. I think we've been talking about this for a few years. The Pilgrim's Guidebook for the London to Walsingham Camino. And you have to just be thrilled to have this out now on Trailblazer.
Yeah, I'm really pleased. I mean, you know a little bit about the story, but essentially, it's about 3 years ago now that I thought, I really like to walk from London to Walsingham, and I was very surprised to find that there wasn't one to Walsingham. And then as I kind of dug into it, I found that not only was it far more important as a pilgrim destination pre-Reformation than Canterbury, but the road to this place, which is like a tiny village in remote Norfolk, was the most important road in England. So I thought, well, look, I'm going to have to, if I want to walk this route, I'm going to have to try and work out where it went and find out a modern equivalent. And that's basically what took us the 2 years, because it proved to be a big job.
So you started working on this book 2 years ago, and, it's obviously when you're recreating historic routes, time has evolved, things have changed since then. And so you have to not only balance the historic route, but the modern as well, and what's available and what infrastructure. So that must have been quite the research challenge, I would think, in marrying up these two. Yeah. I want to go into some of the history of Walsingham, but, how does one even go about, getting out into the towns, villages, and really working through how this route's going to work?
Well, I was really lucky because there's a guy called Leonard Watmore, who's a Catholic priest. And 50 years ago, he did all the historic research into the route from London to Walsingham. And he looked at, all kinds of things like historians' accounts, the itineraries of kings and queens and nobles. And from that, he pieced together a route. But he never walked it, and he never applied it to modern maps. So fantastic that he's done the research, but clearly I needed to apply it to modern maps. And as you say, okay, some of that route, it's still there. I mean, it starts off on a Roman road from London called Ermine Street, and that road's still there. It goes right up through North London, but it goes through places like Tottenham, which are very busy modern suburbs, better known for their football team.
Exactly.
So what we needed to do was kind of balance it, stay as close as we could to the actual route, but make it a really interesting modern walk. And so to do that, there was a little adaptation. But we found that if we moved like maybe a mile or even less to one side or the other, we could find a really great walking route. So for instance, out of London, if you go just a mile or so to the east, you come to a thing called the Lee Valley, a river that goes all the way up for the first 30 miles, takes you all the way out of London, right out through the suburbs, way out beyond the circular motorway around London, the M25, gets you way out on the route without touching tarmac. So what you could do from that was try and establish something that would be a fantastic walk, as well as being true to the pilgrim route.
Well, I'm excited to hear more about it, but I think for context, it might be good. We've talked about, Andy has been on the podcast 2 or 3 times, and we've talked about Walsingham. I was kind of fascinated with Walsingham and its historical, but I didn't really understand the context of where Walsingham fits in the ecosystem of pilgrimage walks and desirable pilgrimage shrines. So would you give us, share a little backstory on Walsingham?
Sure. So Walsingham is a Marian shrine, which means that it is dedicated to Our Lady Mary, Mother of Jesus. And it differs from a lot of shrines, they tend to be to saints who were martyred, Cuthbert, people like that, very holy men. But the story of Walsingham is a really unusual one, which is that there was a local noblewoman, a lady called Recaldis, and she, either in a dream or a vision, was visited by the Virgin Mary, who took her to see the Holy House in Nazareth. So this is the house where Mary was visited by the angel Gabriel and told that she would bear a child, Jesus. So it goes right to the root of our Christian faith. And she was told by Mary to go back to Walsingham, this little village in Norfolk, and to create a replica of the Holy House, which she did. And this was in 1061, so quite a while ago.
Yes.
Initially, it was just a very simple shrine, but over the centuries, it became more and more famous, more and more well endowed with money and jewels, until it was come up to the Reformation in sort of 1538. It was the most spectacular place, covered in gold and jewels, and remarkable. And as I say, the most, in pilgrim terms, the most holy place in England. And
I want to go touch about 1536 in a moment, but Walsingham became, this fantastical story brought everyone to see this shrine that had been built to recreate the Holy House. Kings, queens, noblemen, commoners, everyone made pilgrimage to Walsingham.
Absolutely. And what this guy Whatmore, he found amazing things. Like, what really intrigued me, for instance, were details like Catherine of Aragon wanted to go there. She was pregnant, and she was going to pray for a son, the longed for son. Henry really wanted an heir, a male heir. And so she was taken. We know this because she was guided through the last stretch through Suffolk by the Duke of Suffolk. And he took her on horseback for about 30, 40 miles. And the next day he wrote to Henry and said, "Here you go. I've taken your wife. I've taken her safely on towards Walsingham." And Henry himself, Henry gave money for prayers to be said at the shrine. He went there himself. He walked barefoot to that shrine. But it wasn't until Henry turned his back on the Pope and the Catholic Church that everything fell apart. So yeah, as you say, prior to that, everyone from the nobles, the queens, the kings, and anyone who could afford to, or indeed pay someone to go on their behalf. Sometimes after they were dead, they would leave in their will, "Here's the money, walk to Walsingham for me." Everyone who possibly could went to Walsingham.
So not only was this shrine more popular, if you will, than Canterbury would become, but also you have, it's right up there with pilgrimage to Jerusalem, Rome, Santiago de Compostela, and then Walsingham is one of the four most visited pilgrimage sites. But Walsingham's story is lost for hundreds of years due to King Henry VIII's Reformation and the dissolution of the abbeys. As an American, this is not something that I study every day. So take us back through history class, Andy. Tell us a little bit about the English Reformation.
Absolutely. So, as you say, pilgrimage, for instance, in Spain, which is probably the most famous, Santiago is probably the most famous pilgrim destination these days. They had an unbroken tradition for 1,000 years of going there. So they had all the, what we would call today the infrastructure, the hostelries, the shrines along the way, the guides to take people there. But, in 1538, Henry outlawed pilgrimage, banned the veneration of saints. You could no longer go to Walsingham or any other shrine, and he smashed and destroyed the shrines, ripped out anything valuable, burnt the images of Our Lady. Essentially, pilgrimage was outlawed. And it wasn't until the 20th century that we started to walk to Walsingham again. And in the 1920s and 30s, both the Anglicans and the Catholics established shrines at Walsingham. And from that point, it was visited a great deal. I mean, there are about 300,000 people go to Walsingham every year, about the same as go to Santiago, but virtually none of them walk more than the final Holy Mile. So my goal with this mission, really, that it came to me with this book, is to make it possible for as many people as would like to walk rather than kind of getting in a car or getting in a coach and just going there, by road.
So incredible history. When you think about the context of the Camino de Santiago, we've had centuries upon centuries of stories written about Santiago, of tales being passed down from pilgrim to pilgrim, from parish to parish, from archbishop to archbishop. In Walsingham, that all goes away for more than 400 years and doesn't return until the 20th century. So this century and centuries of storytelling is now just years and years and maybe a few decades at this point old that we're rediscovering this. So this is an opportunity for pilgrims to rejoin this pilgrim tradition. You mentioned a lot of the research that's gone into this. Before we talk about the book and the route, which I'm excited to talk about, I really want to get into this. What an undertaking. You mentioned the Archbishop wrote the historical. Who else are you working with in order to revive this new old pilgrimage route?
Well, there's an organization called the Confraternity of St. James, and they were set up in the 1980s to help pilgrims from Britain who wanted to go to Santiago. And when I came up with this idea, we were in lockdown. I mean, I guess it was the same for you guys, but we could go out, I think, for an hour a day, and we were not meant to go more than like 5 miles from home, something like that.
You forget, I'm in thinking, Florida, so we just put a bubble over Florida, and COVID didn't exist. We were allowed to, do. Our governor passed a law, no COVID allowed. So yeah.
That's right.
But yes, during lockdown, we were all struggling to find, these things that we wanted to re-engage with.
Yeah. So all these members of the confraternity couldn't go to Spain. They were stuck in their homes. So I said to the confraternity, is there any way, like people who live locally along this route that I'm trying to work out, could they walk the bit near them in the hour they're allowed each day? And incredibly, they did. They came forward, about a dozen of them. They walked the route. They took the rough map I'd got, taken from Watmore's route, and stuck it on maps, places I'd never actually been. And they said, either it worked or it didn't work, or this is a better route, or I've been talking to people locally and they say it's not on the maps, but this road was called the London Road or the Walsingham Way, or that there's a cross buried in the forest that local people believe was a pilgrim cross from the medieval times. So we kind of, as a kind of crowdsourced thing, we all got together and refined this route. After that, once I could, I walked it 3 times now, and I'm walking it again, and with groups, inviting people to go with me. But yeah, we got this organization, the Confraternity, who were amazing and really made it possible.
The conversation continues momentarily. For information and links from the show, visit sacredstepspodcast.com. Know someone considering pilgrimage? Share this episode as a text from your device. To support the show, please leave a star rating in your podcast app. And now, the Sacred Steps Podcast continues.
Our guest today is author and pilgrim Andy Bull. You'll recall his first book, Pilgrim Pathways from Trailblazer, which outlines 20 short, accessible walks across England, Scotland, and Wales, detailing 1 or 2 day sections and segments of larger pilgrimages to holy places and shrines throughout the UK. Andy's latest is the London to Walsingham Camino, which is also available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, from Trailblazer. We're going to dig into the book a little bit and how you can begin walking this pilgrimage route. Now, Andy, we're starting in London for the pilgrimage. If I recall, our London to Walsingham Camino is starting where you and I went to visit at St. Magnus the Martyr and the Marian shrine, the Walsingham shrine there at St. Magnus.
Absolutely right. If you remember, Kevin, you were there. You were going to walk to Canterbury and on. And as we stood on London Bridge, and I said, like, okay, you're going to go south, and that's where pilgrims to Canterbury went. The Chaucer's pilgrims went that way. Pilgrims to Walsingham went north. And the old London Bridge, like the medieval London Bridge, if anyone's ever seen pictures of it, it was full of houses and a chapel. And there was a chapel in the middle that was run by a church called St. Magnus the Martyr, which is on the north shore, on the north bank of the Thames. And so that was a really significant pilgrim church. Pilgrims going south to Canterbury would go there, going north to Walsingham would also go there. Now, that church was destroyed in the Fire of London and was rebuilt by Wren. And it's in the 20th century, when I was mentioning that the shrines were being re-established, the Anglican shrine was being re-established. The guy who did that, a guy called Hope Patton, had a great friend, Fynes Clinton, who was the rector at St. Magnus the Martyr. And the two of them worked together. And at St. Magnus the Martyr, they established a shrine to Our Lady of Walsingham and kind of linked that church in the heart of the city with the new shrine, the new Anglican shrine out in Walsingham. And they established this kind of link. And when I was looking for a place to start the pilgrimage in London, there were various more obvious places perhaps, but when I discovered this, when I found that there was that tradition that in the 1920s and 30s had been re-established, that link, I thought, this has got to be the place. And brilliantly, the priest who's there today was very positive. He allowed us to put a pilgrim stamp in the church. He's welcomed pilgrim groups. He's seen us off with pilgrim prayers. So that was kind of the obvious place to start.
So this route begins at St. Magnus the Martyr in London. It runs for approximately 177 miles. I got to get my slide rule out. That's about 285 kilometers or so up to Walsingham.
About 245 kilometers, somewhere like that.
Okay, see, I got to carry the 1 and divide by 6. So Andy, when we're taking this route, you mentioned it's a very there's a lot of the path which is natural coming out of London. We go up towards Waltham. Tell us a little bit about some of the highlights. 177 miles. How many days and sections are we breaking this into?
So I've done 2 schedules for people. One is for people who are kind of quite confident walkers who don't mind doing an average of 14 miles a day. And if you do that, it's 13 actual walking days with a day's rest at the halfway point, which is a town called Bury St Edmunds. So that kind of, and I try and give people all the information they need. So it's like accommodation, where they can get food and drink, laundrettes, loos, anything else they might need, transport in and out of the beginning and end of the stages. So that's one way of doing it. Do it in a fortnight, in 2 weeks. Another is to split that and do it on an average of 7 miles a day. And at that rate, you could do it in 26 days. So comfortably in a month. But also the point about splitting it like this is to say to people, look, maybe you can only walk on weekends, or you want to do it for a week here, and then your next vacation you want to do another week or another couple of weeks. So what I've tried to do is make it as flexible as possible and to give people really everything they need. So they've got the book, they can download the GPX maps to their phone to follow the phone. They don't need to carry maps. They don't need to keep referring to the guide. Hopefully we've made it as simple and straightforward as we can.
One of the real highlights in the launch of this route was you and members of the Confraternity of St. James, the parish in Bury St. Edmunds, all got together not long ago to celebrate the kickoff of this route. That had to be very special.
Yeah, well, in fact, they had a pilgrim day, and the interesting thing about Bury St Edmunds is there is a cathedral there which started life as a church. It only became a cathedral in like the 20th century, but there was a church there, a medieval church, and the abbot there, he wanted to walk to Santiago, but he couldn't do it. He wasn't able to go. So instead, he built a church and dedicated it to St. James. So that church has now become the cathedral. So it's got great significance, great significance. And there was a very important abbey there. It was a big pilgrim town in its own right. Bury St. Edmunds is named after St. Edmund, who was a Saxon king who was assassinated by Danish pagan invaders. But that monastery, that church, was celebrating, well, it would have celebrated its 1000th anniversary during lockdown. They had to wait 2 years. So in 2002, 1002 years after it was founded, they had like an amazing pilgrim event. They walked a pilgrim route from another town called Ely on a 2-day walk, which I joined them on. And then we had a pilgrim day when they very kindly invited me to talk about Bury St. Edmunds and its place on the London to Walsingham Camino. So that was one of the fantastic highlights.
Wonderful place for Camino pilgrims also to connect in England, because, as you said, Bury St. Edmunds dedicated very much so to St. James. I want to kind of talk through a little more detail on this route. How, if I'm trying to do it on weekends or I'm trying to catch it in multiple segments, have you put in the book how to get there through public transit and how to reconnect to the different cities and waypoints along the pilgrimage?
Yeah, absolutely. So as much as possible, we've got trains and also buses. And when all else fails, we've got, local taxi firms in there. But like, for instance, so you say you can get the tube, the London Underground to the start at St. Magnus Martyr. If you walk, well, in fact, along the route, so the first stage goes to Waltham Abbey. There are about 4 or 5 railway stations along the way. So even if someone was thinking, I don't know how far I can do, you could maybe do 5 miles, 7 miles, 8 miles, and you can always dip in and out. So yeah, absolutely. We've tried to make that as accessible as possible. One issue is when you get into the rural areas through a county called Suffolk and then Norfolk, which are the last 2 counties, it's very remote, it's very quiet. So what we hope to do there is, while we have told people what facilities there are, we hope to kind of build on those facilities as much as possible.
Yeah, I'd like to explore that a little more, because you and the Confraternity of St. James are trying to make this route very available to pilgrims. And one of the things that's required is obviously pilgrim infrastructure, affordable accommodations, affordable food. In places it can be challenging, especially in the rural areas. What's the strategy in getting to this reliable pilgrim infrastructure for the Walsingham Camino?
Sure. Well, it's a challenge. I mean, people who walk the Caminos in Spain, one of the things that they absolutely love about it is that there's kind of camaraderie. They can walk in groups. They can stay in hostelries, probably for maybe 10 euros a night. It's a kind of inexpensive way of doing it. Some of them, all they require is a donation. Now, as I was explaining before, we don't have that structure in England currently. So, you're going to have to stay. Maybe you can find a B&B, a pub with rooms, a chain hotel, but it's going to be more expensive, and that's undeniable. And okay, that's okay for a proportion of people can do that. They can think, well, look, I might spend £1,000 or £2,000 on my annual holiday. I want to do a pilgrimage. I want to have a holiday with a more meaningful holiday. So I'll spend that money. But there is also a desire. So like stage 1 was get the route established, get the guidebook out. Stage 2 is to try and establish what are becoming known as sanctuaries. So this would be like inexpensive pilgrim accommodation. And here I had another amazing stroke of good fortune. There is another pilgrim organization called the British Pilgrimage Trust. And one of their trustees, Emma Bridgewater, approached me and said she had heard about the route and she was very interested in trying to help establish sanctuaries, particularly in those quieter rural areas. So the British Pilgrimage Trust had kind of established a kind of a guide, because there are parishes, particularly rural parishes, remote parishes. They've got a village hall, maybe they've got a pub that doesn't have accommodation, but they've got a pub that could serve food. They've got a village hall. Could they perhaps offer inexpensive accommodation for pilgrims? And it's a challenge because there's things like there's safeguarding, there's insurance, there's the logistics of it. How many people do you have? What facilities they need? So the British Pilgrimage Trust has set out like a guide which people can download, which gives them all the questions they might ask and the answers. But Emma was telling me she realized that was complicated for people. So what we're doing now is we're trying to identify maybe half a dozen places along the route where there is no or very little accommodation, where we might be able to help the parish, the village, the pub, the whatever, to get together and see if we can't, as kind of pilot scheme, start offering that sanctuary, that inexpensive pilgrim accommodation. It's early stages. I'm writing to people right now, people who've come forward and have been amazingly supportive of the route. And we hope to kind of really launch that and get that going through the winter. So come the spring, we might be in a healthier position.
Now, you say it's early stages, but there are certain things that are starting to exist now. The parishes are starting to use stamps and pilgrim passports. That seems to be something that pilgrims are familiar with, that's being adopted more so along this route. I've been following the Facebook page for the book, so if you're interested in this route, we'll link it down below in the show notes. You've been putting some great pictures to tease me about walking this route. For those who aren't familiar, some may be very ambitious and want to tackle this year round, but what would the seasonality for the Walsingham Camino be?
So in the winter, like the months we're in, kind of going from October through to March, it's going to be challenging on some of the route. I mean, a lot of the route is what we call tow paths, tarmac paths alongside canals, but others is long distance footpaths across fields. So it can be muddy, it can be cold, it can be wet. I mean, traditionally in England, the real pilgrim season was April. You know, like if you ever dipped into Canterbury Tales, it's April when those pilgrims set off. So April through the summer, through to September, great. I mean, we had a walk last weekend, and it was from Ware to Bishop Stortford, 13, 14 miles. And it turned out the most incredible day. It was warm, you know, we were in T-shirts. We had the most fantastic walk, but it could just as easily have been raining all day like it is as I speak now. So, yeah, I mean, ideally the summer months, but, you know, if people they're used to the bad weather, the English weather, then I don't think they'll have a problem. But, you know, it is an element that you need to take into account.
Andy Bull's book, The London to Walsingham Camino, is available. We'll link it down below in the show notes. Andy, you've walked this route now several times. When are you going again?
Well, as you say, what I've been trying to offer is on sections of the route, I contact the local churches, local organizations, walking groups, and say, I'd like to walk the route with you. Would you like to join me? And that's been amazing. Like I had to cap it last weekend at 26 just because, you know, until you take 26 people through a narrow gate or over a stile, oh my goodness, that's 10 minutes I wasn't planning for. So we've done that. But in the new year, come the spring, we're going to do two things. One is in March, from March the 24th to the 26th, we're going to have a launch of the route and the guidebook in Walsingham. And again, this is going to be, I'm just overwhelmed with the kind of support that this project is getting. So both the Anglican and Catholic shrines have come together. We're going to have a weekend of events. We'll walk the last two stages from a place called Castle Acre, invite people to walk with us. We will also, in Walsingham, there will be events for both Anglicans and Catholics, and also crucially, at the site of the Holy House, which is in a place called the Abbey, Walsingham Abbey. We are planning an ecumenical service. So Anglicans, Catholics, all other faith groups, non-faith groups, local groups, walking groups can come together and just celebrate Walsingham as a modern pilgrim destination, you know, wherever they come from. And I always say pilgrimage is for people of all faiths and none. And one of my great goals has been, or ambitions has been, to make this as open to as many people as possible. So then the other thing, is in April, from April the 11th, which is the day after Easter Monday. I'm going to walk the full route, the 180 miles. And I'm going to be inviting a small group of people to either walk with me the whole way or great chunks of the way. And then we will also say to people along the route, look, we're going to be in your town, next, on Wednesday, the whatever. If you'd like to walk with us, if you could welcome us, if you wouldn't mind giving us tea and coffee in your church hall, that kind of thing. So hopefully we will kind of build a kind of a momentum around it. And again, it's all to try and get the word out, because I'm sure Kevin, there are little pockets of people who now know all about this and love it, but there's huge swathes of people who, while they love walking, they love pilgrimage, they have no idea about Walsingham, and getting the word out is so crucial and such a challenge. So that's why I'm really working on it.
Well, I think you've done a great job in sort of laying out the groundwork. The book, with its GPS routes available for download, with the daily itinerary, short itinerary, and extended itinerary, the infrastructure profiles for accommodations, food and drink, bathrooms, public transportation. It's all there in the London to Walsingham Camino guide. You've told us a little bit about the significance of this. Lastly, Andy, what would my pilgrim experience be? Sometimes I've walked and it's very crowded, and I feel as if that space is good and it's merry and it's joyful. And sometimes I've walked, when I walked to Canterbury, for example, I was mostly a solo pilgrim, or I chose to walk with one person along the way, and it was a good headspace for me to be more reflective, contemplative, to actually see things in nature that were happening around me. On a day-to-day basis, characterize this walk. We know it's purpose-filled. We know that it ties us to our historical celebration of this Marian shrine. But on a day-to-day basis, what would my experience look and feel like largely?
The key thing is to say that it's rural. There are no cities. There are no suburbs to wade through. There are no industrial zones. And some of the finest routes in Spain, I've not walked them myself, but I'm told, you might half a day kind of getting through an industrial zone. There's none of that. This is the English countryside at its best. There are no mountains. Norfolk, some people may know, is famously flat. But you basically, even coming out of London, so you're going out of London for the first 30 miles, you could be in the country. You're walking along canals and rivers. It's peaceful, it's quiet. And the further you get, the closer you get, the more you are in nature. When you come to a village, it's a quiet village. You come to a town, Bury St Edmunds, the towns you come to along the way are lovely, classic English country towns. So even if you're thinking it in terms of, I'd like to see a bit of rural England or a great stretch of rural England, you're going to get that. Like you, I like. Sometimes I like to walk in solitude. Other times I like to join with people. So I think it's really open to people to do that. I know from experience that there are a lot of people who want to walk this route. So I would say you're coming, Kevin, and you would quite like in these few bits, I'd like to walk with some other people. You could reach out to people in, say, Saffron Walden or Castleacre or Bury St Edmunds, and I could almost guarantee there were people who say, yeah, I'll walk it with you, because there is a lot of local interest. People are really waking up to the fact that their village, their town was on this amazing route, the most important pilgrim route in England, and they're celebrating it. I mean, only last week I came across a local vicar who writes songs about Walsingham, who's written books about it, who has 2 churches which are on that pilgrim route, and he's a kind of living embodiment of that kind of folk memory and how it's come down to us and how people are celebrating and reviving it.
I saw that on the Facebook page. That was fantastic. Thanks for sharing that, Andy. So if you've walked the Camino de Santiago, and maybe you've done the Francés and you've done the Portuguese, and you're thinking to yourself, I'd really like to walk an interesting route that was meaningful to me, that had an opportunity for me to connect with myself, to see something I haven't seen, I would say consider the London to Walsingham Camino. I can tell you it's on my list for future pilgrimage walks. So I hope to be joining Andy someday. I'm going to call him up and I'm going to say, hey, let's do a bit of a walk together, because that would be delightful. Andy's book, London to Walsingham Camino, is available from Trailblazer. You can get it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. You can download the GPS routes once you purchase the book as well. Andy, any last advice for pilgrims who are now thinking, London to Walsingham, I've got to put it on my bucket list?
I would say just one thing. You mentioned that we've got pilgrim stamps in 20 of the churches. This is another cooperation with the Confraternity of St. James. They have the power deputed from the cathedral authorities in Santiago to allow people to walk our route. And if you walk a minimum of 25 kilometers and get stamps along the way, and you then decide to walk to Santiago in Spain, you can then walk the shortest route. You can walk from A Coruña, which is 75 kilometers. So essentially, anyone who's thinking, I'd like to walk to Spain, I don't have a lot of time, but I would love to get to Santiago. If you walk 25 kilometers in England on our route, you're already a quarter of the way there. And when you get to Spain, you can do the very shortest route, if time is an issue for you.
I had no idea. That's great. So you can make this part of your English Camino for the Camino de Santiago, the London to Walsingham Camino.
Absolutely.
Andy, thanks for coming on the podcast today. It is so great to talk to you. I appreciate all the work that you, the volunteers, the Confraternity of St. James have put into this book. Looking forward to learning more about it. We'll link the Facebook page and the book below. Thanks for being with us today, Andy. So great to be with you.
My pleasure, Kevin. And thank you so much for what you're doing with the podcast. It's a fantastic tool.
Be well, my friend.
You too.
This has been the Sacred Steps Podcast. To help other pilgrims find the show, please leave a star rating on your podcast app. For episode notes, links from the show, or to contact Kevin, visit our website at sacredstepspodcast.com. You can also join our Behind the Mic email list on the website. Before you go, tap subscribe so our future episodes are available to you automatically.